The beaches trembled under the relentless thunder of war. The American invasion of Normandy was an unstoppable force, crashing against the fortified coastline like a tidal wave of steel and fire. German defenses, once thought impenetrable, buckled under the sheer might of the assault. The bunkers that had stood for years, guarding the Atlantic Wall, now crumbled under a storm of artillery and aerial bombardment. The defenders fought with everything they had, but with each passing hour, it became clear the American advance could not be stopped. The first wave had landed in chaos. The steel teeth of the Atlantic Wall, long prepared for this moment, tore into the ranks of the invaders as they fought to gain a foothold. Machine gun fire raked the sand, mortar rounds exploded in violent bursts, and the sea itself seemed to turn red with the cost of each step forward. The landing craft barely made it to shore before being ripped apart by artillery shells, their occupants forced to jump into the churning surf, weighed down by gear, struggling against the tide while bullets snapped through the air around them. Yet, even in the face of such carnage, they kept moving. The ramps dropped, men surged forward, some collapsing before they even reached dry ground, others pressing on, desperate to find cover behind whatever wreckage they could. Smoke and fire filled the air, screams lost in the deafening roar of war. Those who made it to the beach knew there was no turning back. The only way to survive was to keep pushing. The German defenses had been built to withstand an invasion of this scale. Concrete bunkers, reinforced trenches, and networks of machine gun nests created a deadly labyrinth that had to be overcome. The defenders poured relentless fire down onto the invaders, determined to hold their ground, confident that the Atlantic Wall would not break. From their elevated positions, they watched the Americans struggle against the surf and the relentless barrage, convinced that no army could push through such a slaughter. But the men on the beach were not turning back. Small groups crawled through the sand, using the bodies of fallen comrades as cover, gripping their rifles tightly as they searched for any opening. Engineers, despite the deadly fire raining down, worked to clear paths through the barbed wire and metal obstacles that had been planted to halt any advance. Explosives ripped holes in the German defenses, sending smoke and debris skyward. The first breaches were small, barely enough to slip through, but they were enough. Once a single point was opened, the momentum shifted. Infantry poured through the gaps, engaging the enemy directly, fighting their way toward the bunkers that had been spitting death onto the beach. Grenades were hurled through firing slits, flamethrowers turned strongholds into infernos, and the screams of burning soldiers filled the air as the first German positions fell. From above, bombers roared overhead, dropping their payloads onto enemy artillery positions further inland. The once unbreakable defenses were beginning to crack, but the battle was far from over. The Germans counterattacked wherever they could, determined to push the Americans back into the sea, refusing to believe that their fortifications could be breached. They fired down from cliffs, picking off officers, slowing the advance, making every step forward a costly one. Despite the brutal resistance, the invaders continued to press on. More landing craft arrived, unloading waves of reinforcements, bringing more firepower, more men, more determination. The sheer number of troops pouring onto the beach was overwhelming. The German gunners who had once held the advantage now found themselves running low on ammunition, their weapons overheating, their positions increasingly vulnerable as the enemy closed in. One by one, the machine gun nests fell silent, their crews overrun. The bunkers that had seemed invincible were now being taken, their defenders either killed or captured. Some fought to the bitter end, others, realizing the futility, raised their hands in surrender. The Atlantic Wall, once thought impenetrable, was being torn apart by sheer force of will. The advance continued. The Americans pushed forward, deeper into the defenses, carving out a path beyond the beach. The brutal opening hours had cost them dearly, but they had made it through. The impossible had been done. The wall was breaking. The road inland had begun to open, and with it, the fate of the battle was shifting. Smoke hung low over the battlefield, clinging to the scorched remains of the German fortifications. The sand, once pristine, was now churned into mud by the boots of advancing soldiers, stained dark with the blood of those who had fought and fallen. The sounds of war roared on, distant explosions rattling the air as the battle pushed beyond the beaches. The first lines of defense had been breached, but the fight was far from over. Beyond the shore, the true challenge awaited. The land ahead was riddled with bunkers, machine gun nests, and minefields stretching for miles. German forces had spent years preparing for this moment, turning every hill, every trench, every road into a potential death trap. They had expected the enemy to falter, to collapse under the weight of their defenses, but the reality was unfolding differently. The Americans had not only survived the landing, they were pressing forward with relentless determination. Infantry units moved carefully through the wreckage, eyes scanning for movement, hands gripping their weapons tightly. The air was thick with the acrid stench of burning debris, the remnants of artillery fire leaving deep craters across the landscape. German troops, still reeling from the initial assault, struggled to regroup. Some pulled back, hoping to reinforce the next defensive position, while others dug in, preparing for the inevitable clash that would decide their fate. The battle soon turned into a brutal fight for control of the high ground. The cliffs and ridges overlooking the battlefield had to be taken, or the advance would stall. Machine gunners fired down from concealed positions, their barrels glowing red from constant use, cutting down soldiers who braved the open ground. The Americans answered with artillery and mortars, sending shells crashing into the enemy's defenses, forcing them into retreat. A squad moved up a narrow path, using what little cover they could find. The earth trembled beneath them as explosions tore apart the hillside, sending shards of rock and metal in every direction. The sharp crack of rifle fire echoed through the valley, each shot a desperate attempt to hold back the advancing tide. The soldiers kept moving, dragging the wounded with them, refusing to let the enemy regain control. Grenades were hurled into enemy positions, the blast sending dirt and bodies into the air. A bunker that had seemed impenetrable only minutes before now lay in ruins, its occupants silenced. One by one, the fortified positions fell, the defenders overwhelmed by the sheer force bearing down on them. The Americans moved with precision, their training and discipline driving them forward even as exhaustion set in. The German lines wavered, officers shouted orders, but their voices were drowned out by the chaos. Some units held firm, determined to fight to the last, but others had begun to retreat. They had underestimated the enemy, believing the invasion would be crushed before it truly began. Now they faced a force that could not be stopped. As the sun began to sink lower in the sky, the battlefield stretched far beyond where it had begun that morning. What had once been an unbreakable wall of defense was now riddled with holes, crumbling under the pressure of the advancing troops. The Americans had taken the high ground, secured the vital routes inland, and pushed deep into territory once thought untouchable. But victory did not come without a cost. The ground was littered with fallen soldiers, their weapons still clutched in frozen hands. Medics worked tirelessly, dragging the wounded to safety, trying to keep them alive long enough to see another dawn. The air was filled with the sounds of groaning men, the distant rumble of tanks moving forward, and the steady rhythm of footsteps marching toward the next battle. The German forces had thrown everything they had into stopping the invasion, but it had not been enough. The Americans had proven that no fortress was impenetrable, no army invincible. The battle had shifted, and with it, the course of the war. The road ahead was still long, but with each step forward, the enemy's grip on Europe weakened. The tide had turned, and nothing would stand in its way. The battle raged on as the soldiers pressed further inland, moving beyond the battered coastline and into the countryside. Smoke still billowed from the wreckage of burned-out bunkers, the ground littered with shattered helmets, spent ammunition, and the bodies of those who had fought to defend or claim this land. The fields and hedgerows ahead, seemingly untouched compared to the ravaged beach, concealed a new kind of danger. Enemy forces that had fallen back, determined to regroup and resist with whatever strength remained. The roads leading away from the coast were littered with abandoned vehicles, their frames scorched and twisted from airstrikes and shelling. German forces had been forced into retreat, but they had not yet collapsed. They knew the terrain well, using every natural barrier as a shield, setting up ambushes along narrow paths, waiting for the advancing Americans to push forward. The fight was no longer one of overwhelming firepower, but of strategy, cunning, and endurance. The enemy had dug into the villages and farmhouses, turning each structure into a defensive position. Rifle barrels protruded from windows, snipers concealed themselves in church towers, and machine gunners waited behind stone walls, ready to unleash destruction on anything that moved. The Americans had no choice but to fight their way through, street by street, clearing each building, securing every crossroad. The air was filled with the sharp cracks of gunfire, the distant echoes of artillery, and the shouted orders of officers driving their men forward. A squad moved through the ruins of a small town, their steps cautious, rifles raised. The silence was deceptive. Every shadow, every doorway, every pile of rubble could conceal a threat. A sudden burst of fire sent them diving for cover, bullets chipping away at the stone walls around them. They returned fire, advancing through the narrow streets, using grenades to clear the buildings one by one. The enemy fought with the desperation of those who knew there was nowhere left to run. As the battle spread through the countryside, the thick hedgerows of Normandy became both a shield and a trap. The dense greenery blocked visibility, creating corridors of combat where soldiers moved blindly, only able to react when they were nearly upon the enemy. Tanks struggled to navigate through the overgrown paths, their crews forced to rely on infantry to flush out hidden defenders before advancing further. The Germans had positioned machine gun nests at key intersections, making every step forward a costly one. The fighting became a brutal contest of survival, neither side willing to give ground easily. The Americans called on artillery to break the deadlocks, shells pounding the fields, sending dirt and debris skyward. When the smoke cleared, they moved quickly, storming the enemy positions before they could recover. The Germans, outnumbered and outgunned, fought with the determination of men who knew retreat meant surrender. Some units resisted until the last bullet was fired, while others, realizing the futility, abandoned their posts and melted into the forests beyond. The momentum was now fully with the invaders. What had begun as a desperate struggle to gain a foothold had transformed into a relentless drive forward. Reinforcements poured in from the beaches, fresh troops replacing the exhausted, tanks rolling off landing craft, artillery pieces being positioned to support the ever-expanding front. The once mighty German defenses, thought to be impenetrable, had been broken apart, and the enemy was now scrambling to form new lines of resistance deeper inland. The scale of the invasion was impossible to ignore. The sheer number of soldiers, vehicles, and aircraft involved made it clear that there was no stopping what had begun. The Germans, despite their fierce resistance, were being forced back, their carefully planned defenses failing to halt the relentless advance. Their officers knew they could not hold forever, but they fought for every town, every hill, every position that might slow the inevitable. As the day stretched on, the fields of Normandy bore witness to the full weight of war. The once quiet villages were now smoking ruins, the roads littered with the wreckage of both armies. The skies above, once dominated by the Luftwaffe, now belonged to the Allies, their bombers and fighters, ensuring that no retreating unit could reorganize without coming under attack. The Americans had broken through, and there was no turning back. With each mile gained, the enemy's grip on the region weakened. Their supply lines were severed, their command structure in disarray. Some German officers made the decision to pull back toward more defensible positions, while others, unwilling to accept defeat, ordered their men to fight to the last. The battle had become one of attrition, but the outcome was already clear. The invaders had come in overwhelming force, and they would not stop until every last stronghold had fallen. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the battlefield. Fire still burned in the distance, smoke curling into the darkening sky. The soldiers, though weary, continued onward, their rifles ready, their resolve unshaken. They knew the fight was not yet over, that ahead of them lay more resistance, more battles to be won. But they also knew that what had been set into motion could not be reversed. Normandy belonged to them now, and soon all of France would follow.